Good morning. So 3 scriptures this morning. First one about prophets, the second one about eating food sacrificed to idols, and the third about unclean spirits. Now it's time to vote. How many of you want to hear the sermon about prophets? 1, 2, 3, 4. How many of you want to hear the sermon about food sacrificed to idols? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. How many of you want to hear the sermon about, what was our third option? Unclean spirits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. I was betting on the other ones. That's okay. So Mark, chapter 1. Each of the scriptures is very similar. Let me find the right sermon here. Sorry. Okay. Each of the scriptures is very similar because it starts with a problem, right, and it moves to a solution. And then the question is to figure out what's the relationship between that problem and solution and ours, right? And the problems are not as straightforward as we might think, right? So the problem we start with, in the question about unclean spirits, is the question about trying to figure out what's going on in the world around us. Right? So there's problems in our world, there's problems in the ancient world where they didn't know what was happening. And they lived in a world in which the spiritual and the physical were always intertwined. It wasn't like, well, this is spiritual stuff and this is physical stuff, right? So there's Wes, the pastor, right? And then there's, John the doctor, and you can choose which you go to, but one person has this job and the other person has that job, and these are separate things, right? In Jesus' day, in many parts of the world still, those jobs aren't quite as distinct as we're used to them being, and especially so in Jesus' day. So that so much of the world was understood as conflict between spiritual powers. So that things that happened, the good things that happened, meant that the good side was winning, and bad things that happened meant that the bad side was winning. Right? And so when something bad happened, you tried to figure out, well, how can we sort of bolster the good sides that the good side wins here, or fight the bad sides that the good side wins here. And when good things happened, then of course you were grateful and thankful, and you tried to figure out ways of keeping this going. Right? So that was sort of what was going on in the background. But there's another thing going on in this text. Right? So if we start in verse... which verse are we starting at? I'm sorry. I'm
21.
21, thank you. If we start in verse 21, we start, in fact, with Jesus teaching. And then we go to the unclean spirit part, and then we go back to the teaching. And these two things are very much connected in Jesus' world. Because Jesus, in his teaching, is claiming some sort of connection to God. He's teaching them about God. And the question is, well, how does he know about God? And because he didn't go to seminary, right? And he's not an expert on the law like the other experts on the law. And he doesn't have the extensive knowledge base that other professors of the law or of the Bible would have had in his day. So who is this dude, and how come he knows anything at all? In Jesus' day, however, wisdom wasn't really something that came from universities. Knowledge came from universities, and people did go to universities, not so much in Israel, but in other parts of the world. But wisdom ultimately came from God. Right? And the idea is that you can know a lot of facts, but that doesn't give you wisdom. That's just a bunch of facts. And so wisdom is something that comes from God. So then the question is, if someone claims wisdom, how do we know about their connection to God? Right? Or is this just stuff they're making up as they go? And for Jesus and for many other people in his day, the answer is, well, if I can do miracles, then you know about my connection to God, because that's where the power comes from. It's not like Jesus had power over unclean spirits. Jesus had a connection to God who had power over unclean spirits. So that's how he got things done. And so then once he can do that, then when he says something that is about God, you go, ah, this man has a connection to God, therefore what he says is probably something we should listen to. He's not just making this stuff up as he goes along. And he's just proved to us his connection to God. Right? So that's where, when Jesus wins this sort of battle he's in with the unclean spirit, you go, okay. Right? The people went, okay, now we know how it is that Jesus knows the stuff he knows, right? Because of his connection to God. And so that's how we can know that his teachings are true. So far, so good? Okay. The next step for me is to take this, and last Sunday we talked a bit about Ghana and our new connection with Good News Theological Seminary in Ghana. And there was so often when I was teaching in Ghana that I would start to explain these things to my students, and they would sort of look at me blankly, not because they didn't understand, but because they already did understand. That this, right, when I teach this sort of stuff in North America, right, to my students, it's sort of a long process of trying to get them into that worldview, to get their head into this idea of wisdom coming from God. And this knowledge comes from God thing, and then you have to get them into this idea of like miracles being an actual thing, right? And then you have to explain to them that unclean spirits might be an actual thing, and so then, right, it takes this long explanation to finally get around to the place where you can say, and therefore. And in Ghana, I would just sort of look at them and they would already be nodding, because this was, in a lot of ways, still their worldview. And so they would sort of, more often correct me than I would correct them on things like that. But they also knew that it wasn't that simple. That it looks really simple on paper, right? Somebody stands up and says something, and then they do the healing, and then their knowledge comes from God. One of my students, his name was Godwin, and Godwin was an amazing person in a lot of ways, and not amazing person in others. Depending on if you asked his congregation or his wife. Right? But Godwin had power over unclean spirits. And Godwin had brought people back from the dead. He had raised people to life. More than Jesus. Right? And people came from other parts of the country, hours and hours and hours, for Godwin to pray for them. And he healed people. And he could tell stories about healing that, wow. But when Godwin's child got sick, Godwin took him to the doctor. Because he was always a bit suspicious about himself. He was always a bit suspicious about his own connection to God. So it's not, right? I mean, it's not like, well, back in the old days they had this really simple worldview that we're much past, right? And these people in Africa, they don't really understand what's going on. It's like, wow, I had no idea what was going on so much of the time in Ghana. But what do we do with this passage? What do you do when you read the Bible and it talks about unclean spirits? What really goes through your head? Someone want to volunteer, take this brave step of saying, what goes through your head when you hear unclean spirits? So what is the connection between that and your world?
Mental illness.
You think mental illness?
Well, sometimes, though, it would be something we do to ourselves to make us more unclean. Like maybe drink too much.
Okay.
Or eat too much, many sweets.
Uh-huh.
Or let ourselves get out of control.
Okay.
It's not, I would agree with her that mental illness, it's not always under your own control at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other thoughts? Unclean spirits, Rachel.
Well, I grew up in a Pentecostal church, so that was just a regular way of thinking about how human beings operated in the world. And I think at some point, I felt like those poor spirits were just getting scapegoated for everything that human beings are naturally inclined to do. But that there were things that were very mysterious that I did not understand. And furthermore, the more terrible a human being's situation was, the more likely it seemed that was a relevant explanation.
So it's still tricky.
Very tricky.
Corey, did you?
My brother, who's on my mind today, he would describe it as, you just spend too much time inside your own head. There's only so much in there, and at some point, the real faint voices, the faint ideas seem louder and louder and better and better. Eventually, you're acting on those ideas. But to some extent, that's what Rachel's saying as well. It's the natural state of things.
Apart from mental illness, for those of you who don't know, I'm a psychiatrist, so I have feelings about this. But apart from mental illness, I have also seen evil, and I believe that evil forces exist, and I believe that people open their minds, or by circumstances are opened up to, sometimes by the choices of others, are opened up to the forces of evil, to unclean spirits. And a lot of that, I think, I like that, you spend too much time in your head and not being open to it.
So in a lot of ways, the things that Jesus was dealing with haven't gone away. Not like we've solved all of this stuff. Right? We have the same sort of problems that in our day that people had in Jesus' day. And we often recognize that both mental and physical illnesses are signs of something deeper. There's something else going on besides the obvious. And you can treat the disease, but there's still something else going on, and it's hard. Another thing that physicians, that the medical world does, right, is they try to spin it so it sounds better. So our daughter has scoliosis, and they have no idea why she has scoliosis. But they don't like to say that. So they call it idiopathic. And idiopathic is a word that means we have no idea. But we have no idea is a negative word, and idiopathic is a positive diagnosis. Right? So it's all spin. Right? It's just a cool way to spin ignorance. Right? So there's all this, these things haven't changed, and we still also have the problem of fake news. Right? Exactly. Right. So how do we know when somebody says this is the truth that this is the truth? And this is mostly a congregation of NPR people, right? So we trust NPR. Right, but not so much Fox. But you go to this church down the street, and they're all listening to Fox and not NPR. Right? And how do we know that NPR is better than Fox? Well, we think we know why we know that, but right? And so we live in a world in which apparently coal jobs are going to all come back magically. 11 million undocumented people are going to magically disappear, and the churches are all going to be full again. Right? This time next year, no problem. And maybe that'll all happen, but some of us aren't holding our breath. So the distance between Jesus' conflict with the evil spirits and us isn't really that great. At first it looks like, wow, this just isn't us at all, because we're sophisticated, intelligent, modern people, and then you start to look at it, because the question always is, how do we know whom to believe? That question is never going to go away. So part of our heritage as Christians is to say we're just going to keep circling back to Jesus. As a scholar, I can assure you that that's not simple either. And so this coming Thursday, we're going to dive into the passion stories, the stories of Jesus' death, and we're going to discover quickly how unsimple they are as well. But that's all we got. I mean, that's not all we got, but that's where we need to start. We need to keep circling back to Jesus, to try to figure out, not because it's simple, because that is, for us as followers of Jesus, a place to begin.